Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Tonight, we'll be starting our reading at page 180 of Marcus Garvey and the Vision of Africa. We're in the section called The Movement in Transition from 1925 to 1927, which were the years Garvey was in jail. I'd like you to meet the other hosts on KWAZ Radio Network.
Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondent, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
I want to say greetings to Anthony McPhail. Thanks so much for tuning in. The Impact of Marcus Garvey on the Harlem Renaissance by John Henrik Clarke. The period of the Harlem Renaissance is nearly always written about with major emphasis on writers, artists, and other cultural figures. Though these dimensions are important, there are other aspects of this period that deserve attention and analysis. In some ways, the 1920s were a time similar to that time. Black Americans were discarding some old illusions and were taking on new ones. It was a period of self-discovery, and we were calling ourselves new Negroes with the same vigor that some present-day Afro-Americans are using to say that they are Black and beautiful. In the years following the end of the First World War, when America's promises to us had been betrayed again, we looked once more towards Africa and dreamed of a time and place where our essential manhood was not questioned. A leader emerged and tried to make this dream into a reality. His name was Marcus Garvey. The personality and the movement founded by Marcus Garvey, together with the writers and artists of the Renaissance period, helped to put the community of Harlem on the map. While the literary aspect of the Renaissance was unfolding, Marcus Garvey and his Universal Negro Improvement Association, using Harlem as his base of operation, built the largest mass movement among Black people that this country has ever seen. This movement had international importance and was considered to be a threat to the colonial powers of Europe, who were entrenched in Africa. For about 12 years, Harlem was Marcus Garvey's window on the world. From this vantage point, he became a figure of international importance. This magnetic and compelling personality succeeded in building a mass movement after other men had failed. His success may have been due to the fact that he was born and reared in an age of conflict that affected the world of African people everywhere. When he was born in 1887 in Jamaica, the West Indies, the so-called scramble for Africa was over. All over Africa, the warrior nationalists who had opposed European colonialism throughout the 19th century were either being killed or sent into exile. The Europeans with territorial aspirations in Africa sat at the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885 and decided how to split up the continent among them. In the United States, the Black Americans were still suffering from the betrayal of the Reconstruction in 1876. The trouble within the world Black community, the trouble within the world Black community that Marcus Garvey would later grapple with had already been started when he was born. In the years when he was growing into early manhood, his people entered the 20th century and a new phase of their struggle for freedom and national identity. Greetings, Pro Black Perspective. How are you tonight? The Black Americans at this time were still involved in a great migration movement that had started during the latter part of the 19th century and was increased during the First World War. At the turn of the century, large numbers of Blacks began to leave the farms and the cities of the South to search for employment opportunities and a better way of life in the cities of the North and along the eastern seaboard of the United States. They moved mainly into the urban areas between 1910 and 1920, New York and Chicago. Harlem was transformed from a white neighborhood into a Black metropolis and subsequently into the culture capital of the Black world. The migration of the First World War had reoriented the Black man's thinking. Black soldiers have fought in large numbers to make the world safe for democracy. They now wondered, out loud, about why the world was not safe for them. In Harlem, this wondering helped to develop a political renaissance that had started much earlier. This was Harlem's first use of its political strength to gain the control of the institutions that affected power in the community. The movement would later create the political atmosphere that prevailed in Harlem during the literary Renaissance. Harlem had become a Black community early in this century. From the beginning, politics was a form of community activity. After 1900, public recognition was made of this fact. Requests that Harlem politicians had made for offices and appointments in the 1890s were now being reconsidered. Spokesmen arose on all levels of municipal politics and demanded greater recognition of the community. Before this time, Black Americans' almost religious devotion to the Republican Party had hampered their effectiveness in the politics of this city. The Republican Party was sure of the Black vote and did not feel compelled to cater to it. We're in a time similar to that today with the Democratic Party, by the way. The Democratic Party was not sure of this vote and had not decided to make a serious attempt to bring Harlem voters into the Democratic camp. The activity of Harlem's first major politicians changed this situation and started both parties to catering to the city's Black voters. Early in the 20th century, the first Black politician of great significance in the history of the city arose in the Republican Party. His name was Charles W. Anderson. Anderson was a self-educated and a self-made man. Born in Oxford, Ohio, a year after the Civil War ended, he came to New York at the age of 20. He immediately became active in local Republican politics. In 1890, he was elected president of the Young Men's Colored Republican Club of New York County. As a reward for political work, he was appointed to the position of gauger or exciseman in a district of the Internal Revenue Service. From this not too important position, Charles W. Anderson became the recognized colored Republican leader of New York. He quickly rose from gauger to private secretary of New York's state treasury from 1895 to 1898, to the supervisor of accounts for the New York Racing Commission from 1898 to 1905, and in 1905, he was appointed to what was undoubtedly the most responsible and important federal office held by any Black politician in the early 20th century, Collector of Internal Revenue for the 2nd District of New York, the Wall Street District. Charles W. Anderson was a friend of both W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, in spite of the conflict between those two men. More important, he was an astute and effective community politician. He had the welfare of the entire Harlem community at heart. To Charles W. Anderson, improving the race most often meant using his influence to find more and better paying jobs for New York's Black community. He was responsible for the political pressure that got Samuel J. Battle appointed the first Black policeman on the New York City police force. More than any other politician before him, Charles W. Anderson made sure that the people of Harlem got their share of what politicians call the little plums, the political appointee jobs. Anderson was the first leader in New York City's history to push open the doors of political opportunity for Blacks. The rise of Charlie Anderson in many ways typified the political awakening of the Black people of New York City. He was the most able politician to emerge from Harlem during its formative years. In 1898, Edward E. Lee, called Chief, helped to establish the United Colored Democracy as a Black subdivision of the Democratic Party. The Harlem community, still mainly Republican, denounced Lee and his followers. The Democratic Party saw fit to reward Lee and his small group by giving them a measure of political patronage. James D. Carr, a Harlem lawyer who had graduated from Columbia University Law School in 1885, was appointed Assistant District Attorney. Edward E. Lee was made sheriff. More and better appointments followed. The United Colored Democracy continued its existence as a special Negro organization within the city's Democratic Party. Its leader after 1915 was Harvard-educated Ferdinand Q. Morton, chairman of the Municipal Civil Service Commission. During this period, Harlem was still developing a community. Several forces were in motion helping that development. Politically, the Republican forces led by Charles W. Anderson were growing stronger. The competing Democratic force was gaining influence and demanding more patronage for the community. Marcus Garvey and his Back to Africa movement was preaching a kind of Black nationalism that had never before been heard in this country. These competing forces started the campaign for Black district leadership in Harlem. When this campaign was won, they raised their sights and once more aimed at making Harlem a congressional district. The early participants in this campaign were Fred R. Moore, editor and publisher of the New York Age; T. Thomas Fortune, former editor of The Age; then editor of the Garvey publications, Charles W. Anderson, the leading Harlem Republican, Ferdinand Q. Morton, leading Harlem Democrat, Edward A. Johnson, Harlem's first assemblyman, and the militant Black socialist, Black nationalist, and Garveyite Hubert H. Harrison. The Black cultural explosion referred to as the Negro Renaissance or the Harlem Literary Renaissance was born around 1920 and developed during the artificial prosperity and gaiety that followed the First World War. In 1921, an all Black variety show called Shuffle Along opened at the 63rd Street Theater in New York. This show, that played to packed houses night after night, brought to the public attention a large number of Black performing artists for the first time and opened doors for other Black performers in other areas of the theater, including drama. Throughout the 20s, as Langston Hughes has said, the Negro was in vogue. White interest in Black people, especially Black artists, writers, and performers, became a national pastime. Harlem became the new entertainment arena, literally a magnet drawing thousands of white people to its nightclubs. They came uptown to Harlem to engage in a kind of pseudo social equality with Black people. The white nightclub owners who did not welcome Negro patronage misread the signs of the times and lost some white patronage because of their Jim Crow policies. Entertainment by Black performers soared to new heights. The best known names were Ronald Hayes, Paul Robeson, Florence Mills, Bessie Smith, Ethel Waters, and Louis Armstrong. In the theater, Black actors were mainly appearing in plays written by white writers. Charles Gilpin became one of the first Black romantic stars when he appeared playing the leading role in The Emperor Jones by Eugene O'Neill in 1920. In 1923, another O'Neill play, All of God's Children Got Wings, starred Paul Robeson. Other plays presented during this period were In Abraham's Bosom by Paul Green, Porgy by DuBose Hayward, Scarlet Sister Mary by Julia Peterkin, and Green Pastures. Two of these plays won Pulitzer Prizes. The new interest in the theater and the success of a growing number of Black stars affected the Harlem community in many ways. Local theater groups were established. They performed plays by Black playwrights, but more often preferred popular plays by white writers that had already been successfully staged on Broadway. The visual arts were going through a period of transition. The Black artists lost their doubts about painting Black subjects, though some of them were more interested in success than in artistic integrity. The painters, Thomas Benton, Winold Rice, and others led the way. The Harmon Foundation, that awarded annual prizes for the best paintings by Negro artists, made a major contribution toward making Black subjects popular with Black artists. The creative beating heart of the Harlem Renaissance was its writers and their interpreter, Alain Locke. The personality of Alain Locke stood astride this period in such a way that no competent history of the period can be written without a reference to him. His ability extended far beyond the appraisal of writers and their works. He was a major intellect. No other person saw the Harlem literary renaissance with greater insight into its dimensions and the potential it held for the future. In 1925, Alain Locke, explained the special Harlem issue of the magazine Survey Graphic, which he edited into the anthology The New Negro. This book, recently reissued in paperback, is a milestone and a guide to the Afro American thought, literature, and art in the middle 1920s. The announced objective of the volume to register the transformation of the inner and outer life of the Negro in America that has so significantly taken place in the last few preceding years was achieved, and the book went far in beyond this achievement. The poet and teacher Robert Hayden, writing the introduction of the new edition of this work, says it was the definitive presentation of the artistic and social goals of the new Negro movement. Perhaps, he continues, it is no exaggeration to say that this book helped to create the movement. Certainly, it had the effect of a manifesto when it appeared, and it remains an invaluable document of the cultural aspects of the Negro struggle as they were revealed by the work of artists and writers in Harlem during the 1920s. Dr. Locke observed that his generation of Black writers and artists had opened new doors and asked new questions that could not be ignored. He saw the Harlem literary renaissance as a significant sign of racial awakening on a national and perhaps even a world scale. Within the pages of The New Negro, he brought together the essence of the creative writing talent of the 1920s. Many of these writers were being introduced to a large general audience for the first time. His choices had long range significance. Most of the writers whose work is included in the book went on to fulfill the promise that was that was evident in their early offerings. The Harlem literary renaissance was now full grown. Several publications were competing for the attention of the new Black thinkers, the most notable of which were The Crisis by the NAACP, edited by W.E.B. Du Bois, Opportunity, published by the National Urban League, edited by Charles S. Johnson, The Messenger, edited by A. Philip Randolph and Chandler Owen, and Marcus Garvey's Negro World. The three main poetic spokesmen for the new Negro period were Count Cullen, Claude McKay, and Langston Hughes. They wrote with a considerable awareness of race consciousness. They were saying more than 45 years ago that Black is beautiful. They were also saying, in a poetic way, the same thing that Marcus Garvey was. Up, you mighty race. You can accomplish what you will. This literary movement and its participants were soon discovered by an assortment of white celebrities, pseudo literary figures with good publishing connections, and some moderately wealthy liberal whites who were lost from their social moorings. They sponsored some Black writers and opened doors for others. Most of these well-wishers were somewhat paternalistic and possessive about the particular writer or writers they favored. Greetings, Forecast. How are you tonight? Some of them became overnight authorities on the new literature and its creators, and these authorities were as wrong then as they are now. The literary outpouring continued. Some of the main books and writers received wide circulation were Walter White, Fire in the Flint, Jesse Fossé, There Is Confusion, Home to Harlem by Claude McKay, Quicksand by Nella Larson, The Walls of Jericho by Rudolph Fisher, and The Blacker the Berry by Wallace Thurman. There was a little renaissance unfolding in the area of Boston, Massachusetts, under the leadership of a competent short story writer and essayist named Eugene Gordon, who was supported by Dorothy West, Gertrude West, and others. White writers could not resist the temptation to write about Negro life as they saw it. The novel that caused the greatest amount of heated debate among Black people was Nigger Heaven by Carl Van Vechten, published in 1926. This novel created a demand for the so-called exotic novel and started some whites to searching for the exotic Negro or the noble savage. Carl Van Vechten's greatest contribution to this period was the use of his influence to open to Negro writers doors of publishing houses that had not been opened before. Near the end of the decade, the Harlem literary renaissance had run its course and was fading away. The stronger writers and artists who came out of this period continued to produce high caliber work, but the Great Depression helped to end the Negro Renaissance. Artists and writers could not make a living writing books and painting pictures. Claude McKay had a harsh and bitter explanation of the decline of the Negro Renaissance. His explanation should be read, but not without some reservations. He said, in A Long Way from Home, the Harlem Renaissance movement of the artistic 20s was really inspired and kept alive by the interest and presence of white bohemians. It faded out when they became tired of the new plaything. Let us now return to one of the sadly neglected aspects of this movement, the rise and decline of Marcus Garvey and what seemed to have been his impossible dreams of African reclamation and the redemption of Black people the world over. Marcus Garvey's glorious, romantic, and riotous movement extorted the Black race and fixed their eyes on the bright star of a future in which they would reclaim and rebuild their African homeland and heritage. The self-proclaimed Provisional President of Africa never set foot on African soil. He spoke no African language, but Garvey managed to convey to members of the Black race everywhere and to the rest of the world his passionate belief that Africa was the home of a civilization which had been great and would be great again. When one takes into consideration the slender the slenderness of Garvey's resources and the vast material forces, social conceptions, and imperial interests which automatically sought to destroy him, his achievement remains one of the great propaganda miracles of this century. Garvey's voice reverberated inside Africa itself. The king of Swaziland later told Mrs. Marcus Garvey that he knew the names of only two Black men in the Western world, Jack Johnson, the boxer who defeated the white man Jim Jeffries, and Marcus Garvey. From his narrow vantage point in Harlem, Marcus Garvey became a world figure. The Garvey movement began to fragment and decline concurrently with the end of the Harlem Renaissance. This period had a meaning that is generally missed by most people who write about it. This movement had indigenous roots and it could have existed without the concern and interest of white people. This concern, often overstated, gave the movement a broader and more colorful base and may have extended its lifespan. The movement was the natural and logical result of years of neglect, suppression, and degradation. Black Americans were projecting themselves as human beings and demanding that their profound humanness be accepted. It was the first time a large number of Black writers, artists, and intellectuals took a unified walk into the sun. And now, Marcus Garvey, in his own words. First message to the Negroes of the world from Atlanta prison. From the Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey, Amy Jacques edition, Anthonyum, New York, 1969. This letter is dated February 10th, 1925. My work is just begun, and when the history of my suffering is complete, then future generations of Negroes will have in their hands the guide by which they shall know the sins of the 20th century. I know you, too, believe in time, and we shall wait patiently for 200 years if need be to face our enemies through our posterity. After my enemies are satisfied in life or death, I shall come back to serve even as I have served before. In life, I shall be the same. In death, I shall be a terror to the foes of Negro liberty. If death has power, then count on me in death to be the real Marcus Garvey I would like to be. If I may come to an earthquake or a cyclone or plague or pestilence, or as God would have me, then be assured that I shall never desert you and make your enemies triumph over you. I would not go to a hell. Would I not go to hell a million times for you? If I die in Atlanta, my work shall only then begin, but I shall live in the physical or spiritual sense to see the day of Africa's glory. When I am dead, wrap the mantle of the red, black, and green around me. For in the new life, I shall rise with God's grace and blessing to lead the millions up the heights of triumph with the colors you know well. Look for me in the whirlwind or the storm. Look for me all around you. For with God's grace, I shall come and bring with me countless millions of Black slaves who have died in America and the West Indies, and the millions in Africa to aid you in the fight for liberty, freedom, and life. The civilization of today is gone drunk and crazy with its power, and by such it seeks through injustice, fraud, and lies to crush the unfortunate. But if I am apparently crushed by the system of influence and misdirected power, my cause shall rise again to plague the conscience of the corrupt. For this I am satisfied, and for you, I repeat, I am glad to suffer and even die. Again I say, cheer up, for better days are ahead. I shall write the history that will inspire the millions that are coming and leave the posterity of our enemies to reckon with the host for the deeds of their fathers. With God's dearest blessings, I leave you for a while. And then he wrote another letter in prison in Atlanta. This is an excerpt from the Pittsburgh Courier from May 3rd, 1930. This particular letter is undated by Garvey. 2 months after I was confined at Atlanta, they, my enemies, succeeded in taking away the new ship from the unfaithful men who represented me. The same group of men in Wall Street who had used the old offices to destroy the Black Star Line maneuvered to get the officers of the Black Cross Navigation and Trading Company to sign up with them to accept a cargo to Miami through a Negro broker. This Negro broker influenced the men to allow him to accept the freight. The result was, in working out the scheme to get the ship, they got one or two shippers to place aboard the boat a small tonnage of cargo, and then they went around to prospective shippers and influenced them not to ship any freight on the boat to Miami. The ship could not sail with the small amount of cargo. These men, in turn, libeled the boat for non performance of contract with a demand to the extent of $25,000. So the boat was purchased and equipped for $200,000, was taken away while I was in prison for $25,000. Efforts were also made to get $22,250 lodged with the same shipping board for the Black Star Line. When I was sent to Atlanta, my enemies made sure that would have been the last for me. From what I could gather, it seemed that they had reached even the deputy warden of the prison with their influence, with the suggestion of making it hard for me whilst here. The deputy warden of the institution made every effort to carry out the wishes of my enemies. When I was drafted for work, he gave me the hardest and dirtiest tasks in the prison, thinking that would have ruffled my spirits to cause further punishment. But I philosophically accepted the duties and executed them to the best of my ability. After being so engaged for a short while, the warden, a high typed man of character and consideration, Mr. J. W. Snooks, called me into his office and had me transferred to the best position that a colored man could have in prison. This I also executed to the best of my ability during the time that I remained there. I have absolutely no complaint to make during the time I spent at Atlanta under Warden Snooks. Whilst I was confined, efforts were made to secure for me a pardon or a commutation or communication. I was informed that President Coolidge would have acted immediately upon the application for a pardon a few months earlier after I was in Atlanta, but for the pressure brought to bear upon him by my enemies. Instead of signing the papers for my release, he returned them with the statement of premature. It was not until 2 years after he finally granted my communication or commutation. I had hoped that on my release from Atlanta, that I would have had the opportunity of returning to New York to straighten out the affairs of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the Black Star Line, and the Black Cross Navigation and Trading Companies. But my enemies made sure of their game in not allowing me to return to New York. They had already swallowed up all the assets of the companies, which could be removed only by my presence in New York. So they skillfully influenced the Department of Labor and the Department of State to deport me to Jamaica. On the order of President Coolidge, I was shunted to New Orleans and from there to my homeland, Jamaica. And that is the end of part 3B. Did you have any thoughts about Marcus Garvey and his experience in the prisons? I mean, he really had an axe to grind about his enemies because these men were powerful and seemingly they were out to get him at every venture, at every chance, and at every opportunity. I really feel like Um, Marcus Garvey did a great work and didn't really have a chance when it comes to fighting the machine, but he yet raged against the machine and created the greatest pro Black propaganda movement in history. And we need to give him credit for that, and we need to study that or do. Um, we need to either study that or we need to repeat that. That's just my opinion. Tomorrow, we will be picking up on page 195 of the text, and we'll be reading section 4A, part 4, Marcus Garvey and his critics. So I'm sure you guys will have quite a bit to say. I thank each and every one of you for tuning in. I want to thank Afro Native, The Forecast, Sister Raw, Tinkerbell 87, Brother Bakari, Bwana Haguziki, and anyone else that has given me donations and contributions to help support the work that I do. I appreciate each and every one of you. I want to thank the Pro Black Perspective, the Forecast, and Anthony McPhail for coming to hang out with me today. I value each and every one of you, and I will see you tomorrow at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And Sister Raw is the realest. She has contributed and she's always here. She and the elders are just giving me life right now. So thank you so much. Peace, everyone.